muss ein Magnet gleich mitnehmen. So, okay. All right, so we're going to try ourselves at arts interpretation here in a minute. I turned down the lucrative job to become the New York Times art critic for a reason and chose political science. Welcome to my esteemed panel. I'm Catherine Kluwer-Ashbrook from the Bertelsmann Stiftung. Please sit. I will introduce you in just a moment. But I was told by the creators of this film, and I think maybe you will have easily discerned what this was, is that a machine only functions as seamlessly and as functionally as all of its parts. And when it loses either capacity, speed, or functionality, chaos ensues. And when we find ourselves here in Alpbach in late August to talk about strategic sovereignty in the European Union and in a system that has relied for so long on the big brother across the Atlantic, on the assurance of security, both physical and in terms of defense capacities, but also in terms of providing the kind of security that had enabled after World War II our economic prosperity, because that security umbrella stretched all the way to Asia Pacific. And we look to November 5th, when part of that machinery might well be endangered. We have to ask ourselves slightly more urgent questions about what European sovereignty is, how we fill it with capacity, how we fill it with speed, and how we tell our voters the kind of sacrifices and changes that might need. And that is how we welcome you to this last panel of the evening in this room on strategic sovereignty. Our voters, by the way, and if we can have the slide up here before I introduce this panel, think about it similar to what we just saw in the film. I brought you a slide from our own Opinions survey instrument that looks at what are the elements that constitute European security and what are the most important components of European sovereignty. And not sure if okay, there we go. Right, so on the one hand, you see a great interest of European Union voters. This is, by the way, a survey that goes from the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine until March of this year, playing a greater role in international affairs. And Arantxa, you won't be surprised, or maybe others in this room will be, that Spain is the absolute vanguard in this initiative or in this slide. But you see acute rises. Look at the Belgians. And the only place where that has dropped, which I find remarkable, is the country which coined, in some regard, the redefinition of European sovereignty for itself, which is France. Because you'll remember that the idea of European sovereignty in the 90s, at least in the transatlantic relationship, based on sort of the assessment of then Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, caused quite some concern because there were fears of fundamental duplication of not only vital components within the NATO defense architecture, but also fears that Europeans might be in a position to buy less defense equipment and materiel from the United States. None of that turned out to be true. And if we can have the next slide. Okay, there we go. So, for the European Union to play a more active role in world affairs, it needs economic strength is the number one piece. So not military resources. Military power, as you see, is far, far off by 20% here in this slide. But it needs, and you see this in the second point, strong allies. And so we're here to probe what happens when the strongest of the traditional allies of the European Union goes away, potentially, after November, and we'll talk about that in greater detail. And what does that do to our own self-understanding of how we have a stronger role in the world? So we can take our slide down, and let me introduce you to my esteemed panel. I'm thrilled to welcome, in a little bit of a change of programming, but nonetheless, of course, right here next to me is, I was going to do it alphabetically, but now I'll do it by seating arrangement. Nicolas Maschik, he's the Secretary General for Foreign Affairs, which is effectively the vice foreign minister, if you will, in the Austrian foreign ministry. And he's responsible for Europe and international affairs, but he comes with a strong background in multilateralism and multilateral institutions. That is what you did your lawyerly work in, and then spent time within the UN framework in Geneva, representing your country, and then, of course, representing your country at the seat of the European Commission in Brussels. So welcome, Nicolas Maschik.
Thank you.
Next to him is no stranger to Alpbach. In fact, the first time Arantxa and I graced a stage here at Alpbach, we had a Pussy Riot performance introduce a complex discussion on transatlantic trade. Arantxa González Laya is the first woman to lead the world's third school for politics and international studies, what many of us in this room know as Sciences Po. But she was previously the foreign minister of her country, with the responsibility for European Union affairs as well as Spain's role in the world, but comes with a long portfolio, not only working for Pascal Lamy, who's potentially someplace in this room, but when we met, she came here still in her role as executive director of the International Trade Center in Geneva. Welcome, Arantxa.
Thank you.
Next to her, a man who, for many of us who follow foreign affairs actively and have so over decades, a man who needs no introduction, the former Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Sweden, newest member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, Carl Bildt. He is now, in his current capacity, the co-chairman of the European Council on Foreign Relations, and he's also on the board of trustees at RAND. Many of you will read him when you open your daily paper. He's a contributing columnist for the Washington Post, and for the next generation who reads mostly online, also for Project Syndicate. Welcome, Carl. And truly just arrived, I think within the last 30 seconds, I'm thrilled to welcome the Foreign Minister of Croatia to this stage and welcome him. He has been the Foreign Minister of the Republic of Croatia since July 2019. His academic background, by the way, is on foreign policy and neutrality, and so maybe, although we have an Austrian representation here, you'll enlighten us on what neutrality means in these contested times. But before he took on his role as foreign minister, he served as the ambassador of the Republic of Croatia to my other home country, the Federal Republic of Germany, and to Hungary. Welcome, Minister Rodman. Thank you for being here. And then finally, I'm thrilled to welcome the head of the European Forum Alpbach alumni group in Poland, Jan Fafel, to the stage. He's a doctoral student at the University of Oxford, where he works with our esteemed colleague Timothy Garton-Ash and Paul Betts on a number of the multilateral challenges that we face. So we have individual perspectives from individual countries, but all of the people on this stage think of this in a holistic view, and I want to start with effectively our host. And by the way, I'll let you know that we here are going to go about 30 minutes in our discussion, which means we'll have about 10 minutes for your questions. And I have a tablet here. Those of you who have been here for a few days know that you have your QR code that you can scan. You can put in your own questions. You can vote questions up or down, and we'll try to fit at least 3 of those in, despite the fact that we have a very crisp 40 minutes to talk about something with great complexity. I wanted to start with you, Ambassador Maschik, to look specifically at this situation which we find ourselves. We looked at these slides, we looked at this appreciation. You're about to go into a big election cycle in Austria. We were incredibly fast and nimble, ultimately surprising to many around the world in adjusting certain aspects of our sovereignty, namely our energy capacities in the European Union, to a shock to our system with the invasion of Ukraine by the Russian Federation. But now we have a potential systemic shock on the other side, all the while we are, of course, as the Union, squeezed by economic competitors, United States and China, and yet there are shifts afoot in the undergirdings of an election in November that could be almost a cataclysmic shock. So my question to you, how prepared are we? How are we thinking about this? And what does European sovereignty in this newly hot contested environment mean to you?
Well, first of all, thank you very much. Thank you for your introduction. And please let me start by conveying the best greetings and wishes from Alexander, my boss. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to come. But as you said before, I used to be permanent representative in Brussels, and I never really understood what the function title permanent representative is. Now I know, so I permanently represent him when he can't come. So it's a privilege and pleasure to be here. Before, I would just like to comment and reflect a little bit on the film that you showed, because I thought it was interesting. It could be like a promo video of the European Council in Brussels by Charles Michel, because it's a little bit how we see our work. So you have 27 individual, quite technical mechanisms that, seen by themselves individually, are very well, not so fascinating to watch. But if you put everything together, that's at least what we hope or what we're working for. If you put everything together, it makes sense. Here was a horse, but it's like a dynamic, positive organism. So I think it shows a little bit what we would call unity in diversity. If we break it all apart, it doesn't show the big picture. But together, when there's unity, you are a strong force. And I'll come back a little bit later. On your question on strategic sovereignty, I think that the title of the discussion, I wrote it down, was "Better Safe Than Sorry." And I think that would be a good motto for von der Leyen's new commission, because I would completely share the assessment that the multiple crisis situations in the last years have left many of us, or many citizens, with a strong wishing or will for more security and safety. It has left many insecure. I just remember the COVID or the health crisis, when also the supply chains didn't work. And suddenly we found out that many pharmaceuticals, like paracetamol, are now no longer produced in our own region or in our own country, and they came from China or India. And then there was a lack of supply in the pharmacies. So I think then we come to the energy crisis, where the question was affordability, was the question of availability, affordability. So I think that all these multiple crises have left us with a willing for more security and more safety. And in particular, of course, war in Ukraine. Where who would have thought 10 years ago that Sweden or Finland would join NATO? So here you see that the wish for more security and more safety comes in very many different areas. And when you introduced strategic sovereignty as original French concept, I remember the discussion then. And even when you follow the discussions that we have in Brussels now, we talk about we want to become more robust. I think everybody wants to become more robust. That's the answer to this wish for more security in many areas. The new buzzword since 2 years in Brussels is resilience. Everything must be resilient. If you look at the programs of EU presidencies, it's the most cited word, resilience. We talk about strategic autonomy, we talk strategic sovereignty. We don't go so far to talk about doing it all ourselves, being isolationist, being protectionist, because this would go completely against our own interests and also against our own DNA. But I think you can cluster our reaction to the situation in the world that you were referring to with, are we willing to de-risk? So are we willing to decrease our dependencies? Are we willing to decouple? If you look at our strategies vis-à-vis the three big powers, I think when it comes to Russia, we are willing to decouple. In particular, Austria, we were heavily dependent on Russian gas imports, and we're phasing out gas anyway because of green transition, and we're phasing out Russian gas because of the war. So there is a big change here. But with Russia, I think we are in the phase of decoupling. With China, we're in the strategy of de-risking, so looking at what kind of cooperation works, where is it risky, where is it not risky, what kind of cooperation can we pursue, and which are we going to stop. And with the United States, because you started with the United States, our biggest partner, I think the expectation of the United States, regardless who will be president, will be that we get our act together and we will become more robust also when it comes to defense issues. My observation when working with the US administration is that it works very well, in particular when it comes to international issues. So I think the discussions in the framework of the G7, I mean, unfortunately, Austria is not part of the G7 and we will not become part of the G7. But I think that what I hear from our colleagues who work in the G7 and with the G7 matters is that there's a very strong and very trustworthy, there's a big exchange of information, the administration listens, so I think here work is very good. But at the same time, did the Biden administration achieve all the hopes that the Europeans had? I would say no, because when it comes to trade, there still is a very strong America First policy, and many of the aluminium and steel debates that we had with the Trump administration stay exactly the same with the Biden administration, and we were quite surprised that although maybe the tone was nicer, but in substance they were very strong. So I would expect the US to follow US interests. So we Europeans, we will follow European interests. And I think whoever will become president in autumn, we have two options. Either we wait and we are disappointed that the first phone call doesn't come from Washington and that they're more focused on the Pacific and China, or we get our act together and we start engaging actively. And I would very much argue in favor of actively engaging because we are a strong partner. We are superstars in belittling ourselves. But the further away you go, the stronger you see how interesting and how big also the European Union's partner can be. And coming to Austria, as I'm the only representative here of a neutral country, what is the role in this European new setup when it comes to more resilience? Is there a role for a neutral country? We would, of course, argue very strong in favor, yes. It will be interesting to hear the argument. Well, of course. So in our neutrality concept, we know that we are military neutral and not politically neutral, so we're not ignorant to international relations. And if you look at the question, because we were talking about resilience, does also a neutral country in the year 2024 has to become more resilient? Absolutely yes. So we're working on a new security strategy that the government might adopt in the next days. We want to invest heavily in modern military equipment. We want to invest strongly when it comes to energy security because we have to phase out Russian gas. And we know that this is a big challenge for our country due to our energy setup. And the second question, and my last remark would be, is there a role for a neutral country in this new security and defense setup? And my argument, of course, coming from a neutral country would be absolutely yes. Let's look on effective multilateralism. We have now spoken about the European Union and NATO, but why don't we still speak about OSCE and the United Nations? We've not talked about them. Secondly, let's look at our geography. I mean, we as Austrians are heavily interested, in particular, in the Western Balkans region, where I think we are really have good concepts. We have invented platforms like the Friends of the Western Balkans, where also the Croatian minister is part. So I think here we can have absolutely an added value when it comes to policy, and also when it comes to military support. We have a big tradition when it comes to peacekeepers, and here also with regard to UN missions. So that would my answer, of course, but that will not surprise you. Is does a neutral country have a role in this new setup? Yes.
Well, I have had the great misfortune of having to read 922 pages of the Heritage Project's mandate for leadership and everything around that, the Claremont Institute, the American Foreign Policy Institute. Somebody else who's read all those things very closely is Arantxa González-Laya. She wrote a piece with a number of colleagues of ours in Foreign Affairs looking specifically at what happens if Europe is in some way, shape, or form home alone. And one thing that you didn't lean in so much in this article, but that came out here is, of course, much of the mandate highlights very quickly that a Trump administration would not bet on the cohesion of Europe. In fact, that's really not in its interest. Its interest is to tear Europe apart and instrumentalize it similarly to the Chinese. Okay, we would have to withstand that. We'll hear from Arantxa on how we should do that. But the other thing is, of course, it pulls the plug on many of the institutions of the Washington Consensus that have guaranteed our prosperity. By the way, the OECD is one, the World Bank is another, the IMF is another, and I think our taxpayers haven't fully realized what it would mean if we're suddenly shouldering the burden of upholding global multilateralism in the Western guise, because that adds a whole other dimension to the very big points that you point out in your piece, which I hope you'll share with us, Arantxa, in your thinking of can European sovereignty still be when we're up against the potential of a narcoleptic or sleepwalking NATO, and really sort of shifting priorities that are, where we have to get to a point where hope isn't a strategy?
Yeah, I guess the question is, how does Europe prepare for a world where the US is less engaged in global affairs? And frankly, if I look at the US, this is the direction of travel they have taken. It's more acute in the case of Donald Trump, whom we know because we practiced him a few years ago, and we know of his hostility towards the European Union. But I think it's a constant now in the US to take a distance from global affairs and to turn and look more inward. So how does the EU prepare for that? Because the last thing the EU should do is put its future in the hands of a few voters in a few states in the US. This would not be responsible of the EU. So what's a responsible EU policy? And one that the EU can do. We are not in the business of dreaming. We are in the business of trying to put together an agenda of what the EU should and can do. In my view, there are three areas where the EU has to work and has to invest on more Europe. The first one has to do with economic competitiveness. You are not respected if you are not economically strong. And the EU is below its potential in economic strength. And this, the EU grows at about 1.5%. The EU should be growing at least at a 2.5%. So what does it take to move the needle, to double the growth? First is demographics. And who speaks of demographics speaks of managing migration. We've got to be responsible at managing migration. Second, it has to do with defragmenting the European market. If we are too fragmented, like we are on energy, and you very well articulated it, if we are too fragmented on technology, if we are too fragmented in dealing with trade in one way, and with competition policy in a different way, and with industrial policy in a different way, and with research and development in a different way, if we fragment our efforts, we will not be economically strong. And we can be economically strong, and we should be economically strong. So our first task is to get the economy to work better. The second, obviously, we are living in a moment of power competition, rivalry, especially between the US and China. We are seeing conflicts multiplying in our borders. We have an invasion of a territory that belongs to the European continent by another European power. So I think it is pretty clear we have to take more responsibilities on defense and security. We have to start by defining what's our collective nightmare, because the nightmares in the European member states are different. So let's look at what we should be, what our definition of our collective risks. And let's invest more. Let's take more responsibility for NATO. Europe today has a greater place in NATO. We have Sweden, we have Finland. This means taking more responsibility. And of course, this means investing more in defense and security. And I would argue that if we were intelligent, we would do this in a more efficient manner, which is pooling our resources in security and defense. Because this is the more efficient way to protect the European citizens and Europe at large. The third one, and we should never forget this one, is democracy.
Yep.
We have a big weakness because we are democracies. We are open societies. And when you're an open society, it's easy to poke on open societies. It's easy to destabilize democracies, not just, by the way, by autocracies, by the autocrats that we have within the European Union too. So we have to work to protect our democracy. And this is an important task that belongs to all of us. Because without that, we are not the European Union.
Well, that if there was an ever better opening line to go to Jan and to Poland, I don't know what it was, because a country that has had the experience recently of what it means to turn the keys of its own democracy over to a political party that then changes the very structure and functionality of the rule of law, to have another government come in to turn that back while it increases its defense spending to 4%, and is potentially the country in terms of the porte-parole that Europe might need vis-a-vis a potential Trump administration, then surely it is Poland. So I wanted you to reflect on what European sovereignty means from a Polish perspective. I think Arantxa reminded us of what happens when we neglect our rule of law components within the Union and the fragmentation that comes with it. We see this now with the Hungarian presidency of the Council. So if you could share your reflections on European sovereignty from that Polish perspective.
Well, obviously, democratic performance is of an utmost importance, and all of the headlines saying that Poland is back on track can testify to this sentiment. But then again, paradoxically, when it comes to security, the similarities between law and justice strategy and also of a civil platform are not that different, because security rests on slightly different perceptions. And I think that when we talk about the idea of European sovereignty, it's really difficult not to take into account the very old question of the European army. I mean, it's nothing new. And I guess that's the reason why Minister Sikorski proposed in March that we should come forward with rapid reactionary forces of European units. And when we talk about European sovereignty, it's also good to ask a question: sovereign from whom, from what? And in face of global realignment, we need to once again redefine who are our friends, who are our foes, and who are our competitors. And finally, if we drag the idea of sovereignty forward, I would just like to briefly relate to the slide that we've seen about this idea that European public opinion wants to see Europe being more engaged on the world stage. And actually, this sentiment has been active for more than 2 or even 3 decades, where we've seen a popular mandate for Europe to become more active, but also to act in a more coherent manner. And may I remind that, the last commission by von der Leyen was supposed to be about geopolitical commissions. So we have a popular mandate, we have a political will, but how does it work in practice? And since Western Balkans were mentioned, I think it's a good litmus test. So how can we possibly think that Europe could take an active stage on the world affairs if it cannot manage its neighborhood and its frontiers, right? So I guess that if we are not able first to manage our relationship on the frontiers, then any idea of playing big role on the international stage is above our limits. And, the American role in managing the process in the Western Balkans was quite considerable. Their role in, for example, diminishing the tensions between Belgrade and Pristina were quite important. So this is something that we should think about. And lastly, while thinking about European sovereignty, within the EU, let's once again return to frontiers and address one country that has not been mentioned yet, which is United Kingdom. And the fact that Labour came back to power proposes a new opening for our relations where security will be very important, and I think that the UK has a lot to offer for us for further cooperation.
Mr. Rodman and Carl Bildt, I want to take in that sense a question from the audience that gets specifically to our borders and the way that we think about defense spending. And I like this formulation. It's more acute than what I would have asked, and I'll ask you both to answer this question. Today we are toothless in backing up European interests. We heard many of them noted by Arantxa, with hard power independent of US-led NATO. How much do we need to hurt until we finally transfer significant military power from the national to the European level? Croatia is among the countries that has also now, with this government, stepped up its military spending, its capacity generating in the European context. Do we need to hurt more for Europeans to understand that trade-offs might be coming in this balance?
Thank you so much. I think so.
Yes.
It's okay. Yeah, thanks so much. I know that Croatia was, first of all, the last country enter the European Union, but first of all, in 2009, we entered the NATO, and now we are allied, loyal member of NATO. And we wanted to achieve this in the 2%, of course, and although when it comes to the GDP in general, 2016 we had a per capita around 11,000 euro, and in 2023 and around 21. Of course, the more is in general GDP and bigger. It's the less is, of course, also the GDP defense budget to NATO. However, we would like to of course, to commit we know our commitment, and 2027 we will achieve this necessary commitment 2%. But it's not only because of the statistic. Budget is not only under the passenger. It is equipment, it's solidarity, it is defense industry, where we invested a lot. And Croatia coming, Croatia is only the member of NATO and the EU, which it's war experienced. We 33 years ago we had a homeland war, and we fought for our country. Our freedom is forged in our homeland war, but in these 33 years we gained a lot. Could you imagine that the country who was once the member of the Republic of former Yugoslavia, now we are member of the most important organization. Now what remains just in this OECD membership. Of course, and for us is security, defense very, very important, and now our vibrant immediate neighborhood offers, of course, our worries, because the Western Balkans is a territory or region for the geopolitical and geostrategic competition, a good ground for the malign influence from third countries. And Western Balkans, I think the sovereignty of the European Union should be represented also with our presence in the Western Balkans. Because Western Balkans, first of all, they are on the European soil. Then the Western Balkans countries are surrounded by the European countries. And third, of course, they can go nowhere because they are there. It's the fact. And fourth, they like, and they are clearly show they're ambitious to be member of European Union. But it is not from today and from today to tomorrow, of course. Similar as Croatia did, the countries of the Western Balkan should fulfill all their obligations and criteria. First of all, the most important, they are fundamentals, rule of law and democracy, what actually also the Arantxa said. But we have to help them. Right. When it comes to Croatia, it's in our interest, national interest, to have a stable neighborhood, secure, stable neighborhood, and we invest a lot. Mm-hmm. It's our immediate neighborhood. Croatia entered the Schengen zone, and we protect not only national border, but we protect also the border of the European Union. And Croatia is a vocal proponent of the European future of the Western Balkans. But of course, Croatia did a hard work to achieve all necessary to fulfill. Yes. But the hard work does pay off. And we would like to help also these countries with our expertise and with our experience. Of course, there is a legacy of the solution for Yugoslavia. There are some open issues, and we would like to solve this. And they are not only bilateral nature. They are, when it comes to the missing persons, we still are searching and looking forward to get an answer for Serbia, for example, 1,797. There is a prosecution of war crime, etc.
Right. We'll get to some of these detailed answers, I think, in our second round, but seeing that time is running away from us, and I have an iPad that is very quickly filling with more of these nuanced points. Carl, as we sit here, we heard that the security step up in Geilenkirchen because of a NATO drone attack is what it was. We see the incursions and continued incursions of sort of Russian power into Nordic waters with different member states. We now see the buildup of Belarusian troops on the Ukrainian border. So to keep it with this question, how much do we need to hurt before, on all these issues of capacity building, because those are all medium-term issues that we've talked about. Sweden joined NATO because the immediacy of the pain that it thought it was going to feel. How much do we need to hurt?
I think we are already hurting quite a lot. We are beginning to understand some of our economic weaknesses. Arantxa alluded to that, and I hope that will be more in focus. I noticed that the word competitiveness is back in business in Brussels. That took quite a long time. I don't think people have, as of yet, understood the dimension of the challenge, but that's important. Then I have to say that the sovereignty thing, I'm not in favor. Mm-hmm. What we need is European capabilities. Mm-hmm. We must look at the reality. We are more dependent on the Americans, significantly more dependent upon the Americans for our security now than we've been for the last 30 years, significantly more. And some of these things are uncomfortable. Just to mention two of them. Nuclear. Mr. Putin is exercising his nuclear forces in public because he wants to be able to exercise nuclear blackmail. I think we are almost certain going to see more of him for political reasons using his nuclear power. How do we balance that? Without a reliance on the Americans, we simply can't. Second aspect that I think you Austrians have been reminded of lately, we are very dependent upon the US as the significant intelligence power in the world. You were alerted to something that was going to happen in Vienna by the Americans. They have alerted even the Russians to what could happen in Moscow. They have alerted the Iranians to what happened in Iran. We could not do without that particular relationship for our security. Mm-hmm. We are facing a security situation there where we have, let's be plain speaking, we have an evil and aggressive regime in the Kremlin. Mm-hmm. And that evil and aggressive regime is not only sending missiles to take out the water supply and power supplies of Kiev as they did during the night, but we've also seen them sending sabotage groups into European countries, sending killer squads into European capitals to kill people. Mm-hmm. And we need to significantly revamp not only the pure defense structures in terms of tanks and battalions and the normal things, but the entire security setup in order to be able to handle these particular threats. That's what we are doing in Northern Europe. You mentioned Sweden and Finland into NATO. Yeah, we are doing that, but that's only part of what we are doing.
Right.
We are significantly integrating defense and security in domestic and external affairs and integrating it with the other countries in Northern Europe, because we do see a security environment that is significantly more threatening and likely to remain so for
And
quite some time.
civil emergency preparation,
Yeah,
in a way
that's-
that
That's
it hasn't
part of
arrived
it, but
anyplace
I'm more
else.
concerned with the security defense integration, domestic, external security, cyber intelligence, safeguarding democracy in terms of information space, and the threat picture, the challenging picture is much more broader than just tanks coming across the border. And that I don't think we have seen, we have understood the full magnitude of it. And this requires European capabilities. Nation states are significant actors, but we need to integrate our efforts, and we need to do more on the European level, and we need to be aware of our dependence on the Americans, even when we must understand that the Americans are going to be more focused on other parts of the world than on our part of the world. So it's a slightly challenging environment.
So this idea of how much we have to hurt and what that means in terms of speed, in terms of delivery of these capacities, Arantxa, I want to go back to you because of your piece, and then this pronouncement that's of course been invoked a couple times by the would-be presidential candidate, who says he'll only be a dictator on the first day, and part of his actions then will be ending the war in Ukraine, and we can all extrapolate from that. That means some sort of Diktatfrieden that basically is runs on the premise of what the Kremlin, and Carl has illustrated that, what that means, and that raises the security situation and the heat of the security moment for Europe quite extensively. What happens on that first day, potentially, when he's ended the war in Ukraine?
Well, first he has to get to the White House. And that's the job of the American citizens. And if you had asked me this question a month ago, maybe I would have been a little bit more negative than I am today, where I see an alternative now that is a viable alternative, that is creating hope and confidence on the US side. But let's imagine that by any chance he gets to the White House. We have to face it's a very sobering thought. If Ukraine loses this, Europe loses it too. Because we have decided to tie our future to Ukraine. We have decided to do that when we've agreed to support militarily Ukraine, when we've decided to support financially Ukraine so that Ukraine could remain a viable state, and we have tied ourselves to Ukraine when we have taken the decision that Ukraine will be a member of the European Union one day when enlargement is over. So we have to be very clear about that, which is why we have to be prepared, not to be taken by surprise. We know very clearly, because we went through this already a few years ago, that there is one thing about Trump that is great, which is predictability. He does what he says he's going to do. So let's be ready.
So let's be ready. We have very short time here and to be ready in many other aspects. The Austrians are taking to the polls in a very short time. Everything that you've all mentioned, medium term, requires fundamental changes to our business model. Arantxa mapped the competition components. Enrico Letta is here someplace in the audience. Mario Draghi has been pushing the same piece. Our business model has to shift into an accelerated gear. Nikolaus Machnik, I wanted to go back to sort of the understanding of what those shifts, because you mentioned energy as well, and we want to switch gears to that economic component, what that means in terms of sacrifices and shifts. In Germany, there's a coalition that's about to break apart because it doesn't understand how to sequence public spending needs. Do your voters understand the kind of sacrifices they might have to make in the future? And I mean this not partisan, political, but what could be coming down the pike, mapping these challenges and changes? Do they get it?
The answer, I would say yes. I mean, the energy security and energy policy is already today one of the most dramatic policies that we have to manage. If you look at our country, I come from a country that has a very restricted energy mix. We use renewables that we do ourselves, and we get fossil fuels that we import. And now we will phase out gas anyway, and in particular very quickly due to Russian gas imports. What will this mean for our country? Can we diversify immediately? If you look at our pipeline infrastructure, it's not that easy at the moment if you are a landlocked country that is heavily dependent on gas pipeline infrastructure. We would, at the moment, we would be very happy to have a sea access, which we do not have, because then we could build LNG terminals that other countries are building. So
that would make Donald Trump very happy because he wants to send American LNG all over the world. But.
Well, American LNG, why don't we use it? It's a cost issue. So it's not an availability. LNG is available, but the question is, what does it cost? Yeah. So we have to look at both sides of the coin. The one thing is, what will we do if we want to diversify our gas imports? We can do that, and we're doing that at the moment. But the second question is, what will this mean in the midterm on affordability? Yeah. Our heavy industry runs on gas. We want to electrify everything that we can electrify, because this will then run on renewables, in particular hydropower if you come from Austria, but you cannot switch everything to electrification. And then if you look at our biggest city in Austria, Vienna, the heating of homes, it's on gas. Yeah, so this energy transition will be a major shift, and due to the war in Ukraine, and due to the possibility that the energy transition agreement between Ukraine and Russia will not be prolonged after the year, will mean a huge challenge for our country. No, we are aware of that. We're preparing for that, but of course it means after decades of gas imports, it will mean a major shift in our energy policy. Mm-hmm.
But energy access to clean, cheap, clean, because this environmental question has come up, by the way, 6 times in here. Clean energy, transformative energy, circular economy powering energy that we can use in the medium term, particularly, and that again also is a black and white, almost polar opposite choice for American voters when they take to the polls in November. How do we encourage that and get there at the kind of sort of speed at which we're ostensibly going to need it, Carl?
Well, speed, it's going to take some time, but just add one element of it. I mean, Sweden, we didn't have any gas, so we didn't have that particular problem at all. Right. But the challenge that we have is that we need to more than double our power production within 10 years. Why do we need to do that? Because of the green transition. To take our steel industry from dependent on fossil things to being on electricity, we will now go back to building large-scale nuclear, because there's simply no other way of doing it. And if we don't double power production, we will lose out not only on the green transition, but also on the digital. I mean, AI is coming. Yep. We are building server centers that are huge in order to handle it, but they are very power hungry. So we need to, I understand it's not on top of the Austrian political agenda, to put it very mildly, but just mention that I think that is something that has to be on the European political agenda in order to handle this particular situation, both green, security, AI, digital.
Mr. Rodman, you wanted to come in on that, the energy and digital point.
Just as State Secretary mentioned, of course, energy is the most important tool of the independence of the European Union, having in mind that only just through the Russian aggression against Ukraine, we discovered how dependent we are on the third countries, on the gas, not only gas but oil and so on. And phasing out our dependency of Russian oil and gas remains crucial. And with this in mind, Croatia, also before the aggression against Ukraine, as of 1st January 2021, Our LNG terminal on Island Creek became operational, and now, having in mind that this energy and security diversification is the most important topic, we decided last year to double up our capacities from nowadays 2.9 BCM up to 6.1 in 2026. So the Bundeskanzler Nehammer visited Croatia, the Germans, Slovenians, of course. We would like to, our ambition, not because of Croatia, given our specific geopolitical position, and we would like to become the energy hub for the region and beyond. So proudly said that it's something that we need. For example, just when speaking on the sovereignty, and so it reminds me the words given by the former U.S. President Woodrow Wilson just before the U.S. entered the First World War, by saying that there must not be the balance of power, but community of power, not organized rivalry, but an organized common peace. I think so. I believe this these words and can be seamlessly also be applied also to today's context.
I want to go back to Arantxa in her former function in Geneva, because we just talked about sovereignty and partnerships. And there are other partners who are democracies around the world, which might offer some core advantages for Europe as it moves in some phases through a lot of transitions, not least those that were invited to the NATO summit, the 75th NATO summit, so including Japan, Australia, South Korea, all vital partners even on the Ukraine front. But there are others. We've not finished concluding and voting on free trade agreements with Mercosur, Latin America, Canadians still tricky. Where are the other partners for Europe that can deliver on these three components that you've mapped out for us? And what's our plan in creating sovereignty more as a hinge function for Europe?
Yeah, I mean, this is an important component of a stronger EU, to use Carl's terminology, which I like a lot, by the way. Europe cannot survive without friends around the world. And frankly, there are many countries around the world that are looking at the EU to strengthen their relations with us. We cannot afford not to have friends on the economic front, because 2/3 of our growth come from outside the EU. 2/3 of our growth depend on the openness of other markets to us, which is why we need a robust trade agenda with lots of partners out there that would open their markets to us, and that for whom we would open our markets to generate growth and jobs. Security today, climate change today, fighting pandemics, financial stability require friends around the world. And the friends are around the world, literally. We have Africa. We've been in a conversation with former Nigerian Vice President Osinbajo an hour ago. This is a continent that knows that has other options than the EU, but are looking at the EU because proximity, history, and the established links for them mean facility, which they favor over other markets. They have other options too, but they want to invest in the EU. So let's be clear that we cannot succeed in this endeavor of making the EU stronger without friends around the world, whether it's in Africa, whether it's in Latin America, whether it's in Asia, the big engine of growth in the world, or whether it's in our vicinity, which, beyond, obviously, the countries that want to become members of the European Union, but there is also Central and Eastern Asia that we need to look at with a lot of attention.
Mm-hmm. To some extent, that means a different kind of diplomacy, a different kind of trade diplomacy, pulling all of those issues into a wider understanding of national security, resilience. All of you have mentioned a couple of times, but it also might require a different kind of intergenerational equity. So, Jan, my last question goes to you and to all of the people in this room, the 600 scholarship holders who've been with us for the past few weeks, and for whom disrupting some of the generational ideas that many of us on this stage, me included, represent is vital to making that kind of change at speed. So Jan, intergenerational equity has come up because taxpayers will have to pay for some of this, and who's going to bear the brunt of the burden? Your generation. So there's got to be some sort of renegotiation, I think, internal to all of our member states. But also, how would you like to see those energies reinvested, that kind of capital reinvested, and your generation brought into that conversation?
This is something that we worked at the University of Oxford under the report called Young Europeans Speak to the EU. And the thing is that young Europeans are less enthusiastic about the traditional understanding of power politics. Climate change that has been mentioned, social equality and protection of human rights are way more important than foreign policy calculations and considerations for young Europeans. And here's a huge challenge for European policymakers, how to externalize those inner European values at the core of our foreign policy making. And something that Europe could aspire, for example, with its strategic sovereignty, is to become green civilian superpower. Thank you.
Oh, I love that call to action. Carl Bildt is taking notes, so I think you've achieved your objective. That was a very short hour. We could easily have spent another 2 or 3 hours with these individuals on this stage. And by the way, with your excellent questions, if AI doesn't replace my job, certainly you all will, because that's much better than I could do. So a huge thank you to all of you, but most of all, thank you for the generosity and the detail-oriented pieces from my panel. And may the Americans decide well come November 5th, 2024. Thank you.